Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Thanks so much for coming out. I'm Natalie Moore, reporter for WBEZ. And our panel will get started with the conversation, and then we're going to turn it to you for questions and invite you into this conversation. But first, we want to thank everyone for being here, our panelists, as well as the Community Media Workshop and Strengthening Chicago's Youth, a project of Lurie Children's Hospital. In addition to host Columbia College Chicago, we also want to acknowledge, okay? All right. In addition, we want to thank the Robert R. McCormick Foundation and the Field Foundation of Illinois for their underwriting support. And lastly, you can see that we have cameras set up here, and we want to thank CAN-TV for covering this event for cable and online viewers. This program is being cablecast on CAN-TV Channel 27, and it's also on YouTube/CHICAN-TV. And information about CAN-TV programming can be found at cantv.org. So I'd like to introduce my panelists first. Right here we have Gaynor Hall Paterson. She's a reporter for WGN CLTV. Next to her we have Brenda Butler, who is executive director of Columbia College Links. We have Juliana Stratton, who is with the Cook County Justice Advisory Council. John Owens, whose work we just saw from the Chicago Tribune. And finally, Chris Rudd of the Mikva Challenge Juvenile Justice Council. So thank you all for being here. So we usually start with the negative, right, about what reporters are doing wrong. But I want to change it up and first ask, is there anything that's being done right? And if the answer is not so much, we can move on. But from our, Juliana, from your perspective, I know that you will give us full detail about what is missing, but are there examples of journalists covering violence in a comprehensive way?
Well, good evening, first of all, and thank you to the Community Media Workshop for hosting this important event. That's a hard question because it's true. I don't always think about what's being done right. I think about the fatigue that I have experienced from looking at the reporting on violence in the city of Chicago, and that's the best word that I could use to describe it, that sort of that wake up, see how many people are in the count this morning, the fact that I decided to stop looking at nightly news because I didn't want that to be the last thing I look at night. So as far as I can tell, I still see it as sort of sound bites rather than a narrative or stories. And I do think that even if the stories are being reported differently now, that we've already kind of reached that point where nationally, internationally, Chicago has a reputation based upon the media coverage. And once you have that reputation and you travel elsewhere and that's what people want to talk about, it's very difficult to undo that. So I guess what I'm saying is that even if there has been a shift, it's hard to detect because we had been so saturated with the negative reporting, with the images, with the day after day about this is what happened today and here's the number. And we kind of got to a place where it became an issue of what's the number today. So, again, I'm sorry I can't really say if there are positive things, but I think, to be honest with you, I probably haven't been looking for them.
Chris, is there anything that you want to add with that?
I mean, I think I echo her sentiment. I don't know, I thought this panel was interesting that we were going to talk about youth violence in the media, but none of us are all that young anymore.
Speak for yourself, Chris.
True, definitely. Okay. So today, one of the things I did, I went out to Tilden High School to run a program that we do at Mikva, and so I asked them the question, basically that you just asked, what would they tell the media if they were allowed to? So just this ain't working. Should I just talk loud?
Just keep trying.
Trying?
Yeah.
Okay. So Brian said that he would want the media to do a deeper investigation about the situation, find out what really happened, and not just make up stuff that's just not true to cover a story. He said, like saying a shooting was gang-related when it wasn't. So I think that's kind of where I feel with this too. A lot of times, I think what you said, sound bites is perfect. That I think especially with the internet, media seems so quick to get a story before someone else covers it. It's just boom, young person dead. Oh, heard he was in a gang, heard something happened, and then that was it. And I don't know, I think that's one of the negatives. I think it's hard to write a positive story when a young person is killed and then when another young person is probably going to be in jail for the rest of their life. I don't know how you write that in a positive way. So.
How can youth better get into the conversation about violence? What would you suggest to reporters?
Ask them, simply. Young people love to talk. They have a lot to say. I know the police are monitoring their Facebooks and Twitter to see if they're doing anything bad, but they have a lot of good things to say. One of the things that Mikva's doing right now, we have this Project Soapbox competition. I think it's 100 schools around the city where young people are talking about the issues that they face and coming up with solutions to solve it. And I don't see much coverage of stuff like that, so I think you have to ask.
Now, do you all reach out to media outlets? You know, when we've done different events, one time we did a speed dating for reporters where we had different organizations set up and reporters could go and get business cards and, you know, get literature and learn more. But I always challenge organizations that are doing good work. Do you pick up the phone?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know BZ has actually covered this once. Linda Letton came out 2 years ago to cover the Soapbox citywide competition. So I think it is on the responsibility of orgs that are doing the work, but the question was, what can media do? And so I think they have to be a little bit more proactive of finding organizations who are doing stuff. Like, I know there's a lot of great youth orgs out here and a lot of great youth work that's happening, so I think it's a two-way street.
So with regards to the question of what can we talk about that's positive that's being done, I think there is a glimmer of hope in the fact that there is an increased awareness, right? So I think us media folks are aware that the coverage has not been adequate. And what you're seeing is a shift. You see it with DNAinfo.com, which is a great example of them covering every single homicide victim in the city of Chicago. Oh, I'm sorry. Hello, is that better? I'll speak into the mic. I should know that. So I was saying, I think there's an increased awareness that the coverage has not been adequate. And so you see that with different organizations like DNAinfo.com, what they're doing in terms of covering the human toll, covering every single homicide victim in Chicago, throwing the resources at that, no matter who they are. That's a positive step. What the Tribune is doing with Under the Gun, what we've been doing with our Beyond the Violence stories. I think there is an awareness that there's more to be done, and so that in itself is a positive step.
Can you talk about the story you did not so long ago about the police and trust, and even some of the challenges that you may have had getting that piece on the air?
So I'm a general assignment reporter, so most of what I do is what's happening today. But working with WGN, which I have to say I really, really like the space that I'm in, because our management is very open to doing these additional stories, right? So it's not just what happened today, which, you know, can be a quick turn, right? You go out to the scene, there was a shooting, you cover it, you're live, you move on to something else. That's not enough. We need to go beyond that. And so what I've been able to do at my station is when there's something that comes up that we need to push, I'm like, we need to do something more with it. And then I have to go to my bosses, and then we have to devote some resources into covering these stories. So there's a couple of pieces that we did recently. The most recent that we did aired last month, and it was about the lack of trust between people in certain communities in Chicago, some people, and the police, and how that is an impediment for police in terms of trying to solve crimes, right? And the idea for that story came from me just being at the scene of a police-involved shooting. And I literally was on one side of the crime tape with people of the community, residents, I think it was in Lawndale. And on the other side of the crime tape, police were busy working. And there was just so much animosity there. I'm like, we have to do more with this. And so I took it back to my bosses, and then I have to get the time off and all of that. So there's all of these, you know, things that have to happen to make these stories happen. But I think when you have people who are really interested in telling these stories, and there's so many stories to tell, you know, we put the resources in, we put the time in, and that's how that last piece came about.
Is it, you know, given that your general assignment, how often can you get the time off to get a little bit more in depth?
And that's the thing. I mean, this is going to vary with different news organizations. Again, I work for WGN. We have a lot of news hours to fill, so we have more time, and so they're more open to doing these longer, in-depth pieces because we have the time to do them. But yeah, it's just literally about pushing for your stories, fighting for them, and you know, we've been successful. There's always more we can do, obviously, but.
So what are some of the other challenges that you all are seeing in news coverage? What is missing from stories that deal with violence?
Well, I used to work for the Tribune, and now I run, I guess you call it a little news operation. Only the reporters here are high school students, and they go into our academy and they become cub reporters. So rather than waiting for mainstream media to tell the story, we're actually asking teens to amplify their voices and tell us what they're seeing on the streets. Last summer, I don't know if you guys heard about the Don't Shoot, I Want to Grow Up initiative that Columbia Links launched, where teens, when they get into the program, we ask them, if you get into this program, what do you want to write about? Sometimes they'll say, oh, we want to write about teen pregnancy, we want to write about fashion, we want to write about cyberbullying, but overwhelmingly they said, we want to write about the violence in our neighborhoods. So we asked all 23 of them to write these essays and to address them to the police superintendent, Gary McCarthy, and to the mayor, and they did. And I can't tell you, for once, people began to listen to what teenagers were saying because these essays were so poignant, and they covered all the issues. What you're saying about police, the community not getting along with the police, how they hassle teenagers, how they profile young people, and so all the talking points were hit in these essays, and it resonated with the mainstream media. So I'd like to say that, you know, yes, mainstream media has its part, and we know what that part is, but there are other avenues, there are other community groups and teens and community leaders who also can lend their voice to the problem and to the issues. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit, but this is what our kids did, and they finally looked at violence as a public health issue and put out a white paper, and we had a town hall last summer. And we had all the stakeholders, the adult thought leaders, talking about this issue, and the solutions. I mean, we're also solutions-based journalism is kind of the new buzzword, where our teens also have solutions in their stories and their voices.
As the executive director of the Cook County Justice Advisory Council, my role is to help further the criminal and juvenile justice reform agenda for Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle. And so one of her key public safety goals is reducing the population at the Cook County Jail and the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, and doing so in a way that preserves public safety. And I jotted down a couple of thoughts in terms of what I don't always see in terms of trying to get that story told, and really talking about how the issue of having an overflowing jail and having too many kids in the detention center really only helps to, you know, exacerbate the issue of violence in our communities. So a couple of things that I haven't seen a lot of discussion. I hear a lot of discussion about trauma and trauma-informed services in the inner circles of those who are working on these issues, but I don't see a lot of reporting on it. So what we saw in that video was just incidents of trauma after trauma after trauma, and I think one of the statements was, violence is commonplace in many communities. Well, the word commonplace really means that it's ordinary, and it's almost, and I've heard others say, you know, it's been normalized. Well, no. It hasn't. I refuse to accept that it's been normalized or it's common. And so what happens when young people in particular, see violence over and over again, and then what do we do in terms of dealing with the mental health issues that result from that? Where is that coverage and talking about what needs to happen with that? Balanced and restorative justice. I don't see a lot talking about, you'll see a few stories, and there have been some very good ones about what happened at Finger High School and the work that was done using balanced and restorative justice. But more about solutions and the kinds of things that are happening in communities all around this city where people are coming together to say, we have the solution right here and we have to reconnect as people. And then a couple of others that I thought of were, for example, how when young people are in detention, that they are really learning how to be, to carry out more criminal activity. And so when you have young people that are charged with nonviolent offenses, and even adults charged with nonviolent offenses, they are not going to learn how to be less violent by being locked up. So if we can do more in the community in terms of investing in alternatives to detention, that is something that will have an impact on violence. But I don't always see that nexus between what's happening with our criminal justice system and the issue of violence. And then finally, I'll just raise the issue of disproportionate minority contact with the criminal justice and juvenile justice system. We know that, and one thing that I have seen is I have seen some stories that have talked about how this issue has been an issue that, especially in terms of homicides, has been an issue that has disproportionately impacted young black males in particular. But again, we are seeing disproportionality from suspensions, expulsions, arrest, detention, the whole system. So we have to look at that and what's happening. Why is it that right now in our juvenile temporary detention center is at 99% youth of color? So really starting to unpack this issue, because a lot of people don't seem to be paying a lot of attention to it, but it's happening, and it seems like there would be more outrage about it.
I wanted to go back on and talk a little bit more about the media, mainstream media specifically, and their coverage of crime-related issues. One major issue, and Gaynor sort of touched on it, is the resource issue. The newsroom of today isn't like the newsroom of 10 years ago or 15 years ago. It's a scaled-down newsroom where it's even if a reporter wanted to go into detail on a specific story, it's often difficult because you're called upon to do so many different things now and multitask. So it's important to not only cover these stories, but also work with people, especially young people in these different communities, to try to bring their voices out and to have them help with the coverage. For instance, one major component of Under the Gun at some point in the near future is working with, there's some True Star students here who we're working with to tell their own stories about victims that they've dealt with or crime-related issues that they've dealt with, tell their own stories, first-person stories that we can help them tell. And present their stories online in the future. So I mean, it's a different newsroom today than it used to be, and things like social media it's so much more democratic now than it used to be. So it's a hindrance that in a way, but it's also a blessing because we have all these additional voices who can help contribute to these stories.
Chris, can you talk some more about what you feel is missing? You gave some examples of what young people wanted you to relay to this panel and to this audience, but even if it's not from the work directly that you're doing, any other solutions?
Okay, a couple things that I was thinking. Whenever we hear about a young person being killed, it's very, and I don't know if this is like American society, but we always want a bad guy, we want a villain. Somebody has to be in the black. There has to be black and white. And when these young people are killed, and if it's a young person who's killed another young person, we've lost two young people. And I think the media has to do a lot better job at showing that okay, this young person made a really bad decision and killed somebody else. That kid is not a devil, that kid is not evil, the kid made a bad choice, and I'm sure the parents of whatever child is killed will say a lot of different other things, and understandably, but I think we have to start guiding the conversation to think about, and I know Juliana loves restorative justice, and we do too, how do we get these young people back? How do we stop that? And if we start vilifying them, that becomes the mainstream. When I work with young people, not only does it destroy these, police-youth relationships, but it destroys employment relationships. All these young men that I work with that have dreadlocks can't get jobs simply because they have dreadlocks, because they fit the description and they fit that villainous profile. The other thing, I don't know, I think we need to start talking about, because we talk about resources, we talk about the communities where these young people come from, and we say poverty is the main thing, and there's this and that, but we don't attack poverty. We don't attack that as a thing, and that the people who cause poverty are adults, so the number one killer of young people are adults. And if we're gonna talk about youth violence, we should talk about that in a way that makes it violent, not just, oh, poverty exists, but that poverty is a violent thing, and it kills our young people.
Tell me more about how you would like to see that story covered. How do you report on poverty without saying this is a poor neighborhood that has an unemployment rate of XYZ?
I think you can tell the facts. I think you tell it in a way, I know it was something about the video, it made me think about like segregation and why these young people are in the situation that they're in, and thinking about historically why young people weren't doing they were talking about, back in the day it was about, personal things and blah, blah, blah. But also back in the day, people had something to fight for. Oh, you wrote a book about the Blackstone Rangers. And so in '63, there was a huge CPS boycott about segregation. And so Timothy Black was a teacher at Hyde Park High School, and so Hyde Park High School had one of the largest attendance walkout, or more people walked out of Hyde Park High School than almost any high school in the city, and that's also the high school where the Blackstone Rangers were founded, well, the head of the Blackstone Rangers came from. So you had this very different dynamic. Young people could have took the road to fight against segregation in a very collective way and not hurt each other, or they could take the route of becoming or joining a gang and doing a lot of harm to the community, right? I know that kind of happened later, right? But I think if we put things in that way, and if we allow young people to understand that there's options to fight the ills that they face, I like this idea of solution-based journalism. I think most journalists kind of just write the story, and there's no real in-depth analysis or any idea what should we do. We do get this fatigue of, oh, another young person is dead. Okay, now I'm gonna wait till sports at 10:25.
One thing you can do, I think in terms, Natalie, in answering your question, amplifying what Chris has said, is to drill down and find that person, that personal narrative, that person's story, and begin to tell that person's story from the beginning, as deeply as you can get to how he or she got to this point. So if it's the perpetrator of a violent crime, you find out what was his course, what was his trajectory. But you have to spend time and you have to dig and get those stories. But sometimes they can be personal narratives. I noticed in John's piece, there were a lot of people telling their personal stories just with the camera or the video in front of them, and they just begin to talk. And that's a way to get at stories. And I think, and once you tell that story, and then you get it online, and then people begin to see it, or you pull it together in some cohesive way where all of these narratives are of people in a certain neighborhood, and this is what happened to them. I think the Chicago Reporter has done something like this, where they trace back the victim of a homicide, and who was that person who was murdered. and all of a sudden you begin to feel for this person, and not just because, we're not saying amplifying evil or a bad decision, but you begin to see where this person came from, what his life was like, and how he took the wrong turn, or how society actually, it's kind of speaking to what Juliana is talking about, how the system is set up with this cradle to prison pipeline. I mean, sometimes you just can't help it. If you're born poor, you're going to end up in the juvenile justice system unless you have these safety nets. And we're having a town hall of what a lot of white privileged kids have already, and our kids don't have.
I think solutions, critically important. Doing the follow-up, so not just this happened, we move on to the next story. What happens to that family that lost a child 2 months later, 6 months down the road? We need to go back and see how this impacts communities. And getting to the poverty angle, it's looking at all of the layers of things that are happening underneath the surface. What's happening in the schools? What's happening with, I know you did a story and I did a story as well, the breakdown of the housing projects. How has that impacted the violence? So it's doing the follow-up, it's looking at solutions. It's not just going to Inglewood when there's a shooting. It's going to cover the Inglewood Film Festival. It's going to cover the positive things that are happening in these communities as well. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more that can be done, but I have to go back to, I do think that we are, and just having this dialogue. You know, I'm writing down notes here. I'm going to take this back to the newsroom and we're going to talk about it. And I think, that's a positive start.
Do you think there should be a moratorium, just going to be radical for a second, and maybe not cover who got shot last night, and instead cover, I mean, everything that I've heard so far has been issue-oriented, and it's not sexy, which sometimes is the challenge that we have in newsrooms, getting it out there, getting it quickly, having massive news holes to fill. But I just sometimes wonder if hearing those figures every Monday morning, or not even Monday morning, we'll hear overnight tomorrow. Should every shooting, should every murder, every homicide be covered?
It's interesting. So I have a love-hate relationship with the tallies, right? So when you hear that tally, that becomes, 5 killed overnight or 5 shootings overnight. It's very easy to get desensitized to what's happening. But consider this. Consider, I think that was 4th of July weekend. There were 45 people shot, or there was some number like that. 45 people shot over 2 days or 3 days. If you don't put that number out there, are you really able to absorb the impact of, wow, 45 people got shot in 2 days? Sometimes you need that. And we're not going to cover. The reality is there's so many shootings happening, we're not going to cover every single shooting. And we're not going to cover them to the same extent. And so I think, it's a cop-out, but sometimes it's necessary just to show the impact.
I just wanted to say, and forgive me because I don't recall the name of the book. Is it How Long Will I Cry?
Free copies, everyone.
How Long Will I Cry? So I just wanted to reference that because I saw the play at Steppenwolf, and I took my 16-year-old daughter to see it. And I remember the impact of the way that the play ended was that there was a scroll of all the names of the people who had been killed, young people, I believe it was in particular. And the number 45 doesn't mean as much to me as the names. So I had heard 45 much like I had heard 13 and 7 and 20, but to see names and to hear stories and to understand what's behind that number is the thing that really impacted me. And so I think what you raised earlier is interesting. I was a broadcast journalism undergraduate major, and then I don't know what happened, ended up in law school somehow, but but when you talk about the newsroom and what happens, I mean, all of you have talked about some of the limitations that are there and the limited resources. it sounds like it's also really a business decision about what's being made, about what we're going to cover and how it's going to be covered. And I often wonder and continue to wonder about the level of diversity even in those newsrooms in terms of the people who are making the decisions on what's okay and what kind of narrative is going to be told about any particular individual or their community.
John, you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is, with crime stories, online they get clicks, and on the Tribune's website, you see crime stories, without a lot of context, constantly being played up in the centerpiece because, to be blunt, they're popular. So the trick is to try to find some way to provide detail to those stories when we cover them, provide context, try to go back and talk to people after the fact, talk to the victims, follow up on stories, because these are human lives that we're dealing with. It's not just a story that's meant to generate a lot of clicks.
I mean, ultimately, there is a contradiction that exists. One of the stories we did over the summer was about how the media covers violence, and the idea for that story came from people coming up to me on the street and saying, I don't watch the news anymore. It's too depressing. But then if you don't cover something, then you hear, well, why didn't you cover this shooting that happened down the block? So how do we balance that, right? And so one of the things you said about, seeing the names and seeing the pictures and how that is more impactful than just hearing that number. Yeah. But also we're thinking, okay, so I have an hour-long newscast. If I put up all the names, that's going to suck out. Once you take out the commercials, once you take out weather, once you take out sports, we only got like 10 minutes worth of news. If I put up all the names, how can I do that? So it's like we have to find a way, and what I'm getting to, we have to find a way with the stories that we're telling to give them context, to follow up, and to do the best job of, just going deeper, digging deeper with the stories that we're telling. Absolutely. One more point I wanted to make. And then, and that was Chris's point about gang-related. That's something that we've been talking about too, right? So let's say something happens, we call police, police give us information. Oh, it's a gang-related shooting. And then that gets reiterated. We need to be thinking about what labels we're putting on people and victims and perpetrators, and what does that really mean if it's a gang-related shooting or the victim was in a gang? Does that mean that that person is somehow deserving of what happened? No. So I think that with that goes back to the follow-up thing, right? So flushing it out before you put that information out there. And a great example of that was the Hydea Pendleton case. I mean, immediately when that happened, when that shooting happened, the day she was shot, the first thing we heard from police was this was gang-related. And she was with people who were gang-affiliated, and they left her there to die. And as the story unfolded, as we got more information, that was not the case. So that's why the follow-ups are so important.
That's actually a story I did for WBEZ and WTTW about what is gang-related, and there are lots of people who push back on this label that is given by the police and then that the news media regurgitate. Sometimes you may have members who are in a gang, but they didn't kill the other person over a gang issue. And then there's some stereotyping that goes on. There was a young man who was killed in West Inglewood. This was my, case study, and one of his friends had dreadlocks, and he talked about being profiled, pulled over, and he's a security guard and has a sticker on his car. But I think it also, in our segregated city, it makes people, frankly, on the north side say, well, those are just those black folks down there killing each other, and they're in gangs, and they probably deserve to die. Or their death doesn't really have any impact. This doesn't affect me. But also there are questions when you have gang-related, and then Hydea Pendleton, the disparities in coverage, the young people who are seen as undeserving to die. And Chris, if you can maybe talk about how you see different young people covered in the news and if that makes a difference.
I think it absolutely makes a difference. I don't know, thinking about what's the purpose? That question was really good about should we just not cover these murders?
Like not cover them as individual acts, but
Or
just
period.
have a moratorium and cover the issues in the neighborhoods.
Because it made me think, why does the media exist? Why do we want to get out information? So we say 43 people were killed this weekend. Did that make people not go to July 4th barbecues? Did the people in that neighborhood stay in their house? Like, what was the purpose? So what is the purpose of that? It just made me think about that. And so to
Do you
your
have
question,
an answer?
No. So about young people, definitely. I think they look at each other the way we look at them. And so if young people are very perceptive, if they know that this young girl who, played at the inauguration got killed and, her godfather was a cop, and so then they said they were going to make sure they find this person. I worked in that area at Revis Elementary when that happened. I'd never seen so many police over there. The school I worked at, they were shooting. It's a grammar school. There's a park right across the street. They were shooting at 11 a.m. regularly. My kids were steadily having to, get on the ground. We had to come up with emergency plans to get them into the hall. It was just ridiculous. These are grammar school kids. And those shootings were happening regularly, and kids were getting killed, and it was no type of response. So it absolutely showed them that it wasn't worth it, that kids who look like them or who went to this area aren't worth it. And I think it's even beyond the violence that they see from their schools. Like everything we say about them from the moment they wake up in this particular neighborhood says that you don't matter. And so then I think they absolutely internalize, and it's very hard for them to, like, they don't even believe we live in a segregated city. I've done this lesson numerous times about segregation, and I work in schools that are 99.9% black, but because they have white teachers, they say, no, we're not segregated. Or they have 3 white students, and they don't understand what that means. But they do know that they're treated wrong, and they do know that they don't have the same opportunities as other young people. So absolutely, you're telling these young people that they don't matter.
I wanted to say, too, you're right, teens are very astute. They know, even though they're not reading a paper every day, Hadia resonated, and the kids, I had kids in session, teens in session during that time, and they were, in fact, one of our students was actually with Hadia when it happened. So anyway, but they said to me, well, why her story? Their kids getting shot all the time. And then they brought up the kid from the student, I shouldn't say kid. One teen said he resents being called a kid. That's what they call goats. But anyway, one student said, what about the young man who was shot in the parking lot at Chicago State? Nobody wrote about him. And I said, that's a good point. And I said, well, look, it doesn't mean that journalists are lazy, because they are not. And as John was saying, there are limitations. Hadia's story resonated, and it just went viral. The young man at Chicago State, all it would take is a reporter to kind of go and find out who he was. I understand he was on his way to college, but no one took the time to find out who he was, what happened to him. So therefore, kids get the impression, well, yeah, she was an honor student and da-da-da-da. So they're just thinking that that's why her story resonated, rather than understanding how a newsroom often works. You can't beat the fact that she lived in the president's neighborhood. She was just at his inauguration. I mean, all of those things are undeniable. But that young kid, a young student in the parking lot of Chicago State University probably deserves to have his story told too. And it didn't happen.
Well, I know that we can keep going just among ourselves, but I want to turn it over to the audience now, and Steve is going to take that microphone. You all can share this one, and just raise your hand and wait for him to come so you can talk into the mic so we can get it on camera.
Sure. Hang on a second.
Hi.
I just had a question. Like, what role do you think that the police play in it? Because if you think about it, like, the police, they often patronize and harass, like, those people. And they have, to my understanding, they have, like, this new policy in place that if you're getting robbed, not to call the police, to call after the fact. So what role do you think the police play in, like, all the violence that's going on with policies like that in place?
I'm going to give this one to you, Juliana.
Well, I mean, thank you for your question. I will slightly reframe it, just not to take away from what you're actually looking for, but I have really kind of came with the focus on the media piece. I will say that media has a strong role in shaping perception. And not to discredit anyone's story, which is why stories have to be told, but I will say that I recently participated in a restorative justice process that included community members and police officers. And what I learned, which I learn anytime we sit in circle or have any restorative justice process, is that there are perceptions from the community and there are perceptions from the side of the police. And until there's an intentional effort to break down some of the historical barriers and have the conversation and tell the different stories, in a lot of ways I saw some level of, I don't want to use the word fear, but some level of misunderstanding on both sides. And I don't think that's always told. So I think I hear from young people, this is what we experience with the police. And I also hear from the police side, you know, we're trying to do our jobs and we don't always get the cooperation from the community. And there's this misunderstanding because there's not a lot of dialogue. And I think that if we really want to move forward on this issue, then there has to be some dialogue and some processes in place to really break down some of those barriers. So that's the best way that I can respond to that question. I'm not really in a position to say, oh, it's this person or that. I mean, everyone has their own experience, but I can say that I've seen where there are differing perceptions on both sides about how this can be a better, how the interactions between police and community could be improved.
I think that's what Gaynor's story was about. That's a good example of.
Right, that was the story I was talking about in Lawndale, where it felt like police on one side, residents on the other. So we went back to police and said, hey, what are you doing to address these issues in the community? And so one of the things that Chicago police started under Gary McCarthy is this, it's a long title for procedural justice and something that I can't remember, training. Basically every officer in the department has gone through this training, and it's literally just about reminding them why they're doing the job they're doing and why they need to be respectful to people in the community and how that makes everybody's position easier, everyone's job easier, and how it will help them to solve crimes, et cetera. And so that's one of the things from the media perspective is when we identify those issues, like what you're talking about, okay, how can we highlight what's being done? How can we highlight what exists, what needs to be done to make that situation better? And so those are the types of stories that we need to be doing more of as well.
Okay. Questions?
First of all, my name is Chris. Like John said, I'm a representative of True Star. I have not so much a question, more so maybe two statements. You guys were talking about how you guys have been to anti-violence events and such. One of the statements I have is with events just like this, you have people or individuals that I'm not gonna say, they basically know who to talk to as far as making programs happen, as far as for the youth, as far as putting youth individuals in programs, not so much throughout schools, but throughout park or field houses or just different organizations throughout the city. So one of the statements I wanna make is, why not have another event like this, but instead of it being at Columbia College, have it be in some of these areas that are throughout the city. Little Black Pearl Art Workshop that's on, I believe, 47th and Green, or Tully Park that's on 91st and King Drive, or Harlan High School that's on 95th and Michigan. Like, actually have some of these events there and have the same type of setup where it's like the same individuals as panelists, but instead of it being where like this is the audience, you actually have the students of the high schools and like the students and kids that are actually interested in actually like stopping this violence. 'Cause I'm telling you, if you would have had the same setup in those areas, like the response would be like ridiculous. Like the video, like it would have been like almost like a standing ovation looking at that video. One, because it's being documented for one. Two, because there is gonna be like 1,000,000,001 ideas. So that's my statement, like have these events in those areas. So that's it.
I'll respond to Chris. Chris, when we started this program, We Are Not Alone, we met almost exclusively in the Black and Latino communities. We switched back and forth, and our effort was in Spanish and English. And so as Natalie, who's been with us from the start, we're doing this here at Columbia because the workshop's based at Columbia, but as we started and we worked, our original goal was to meet in communities. So I think your idea is really on target, and that's how we started doing our work, and hopefully we'll continue. Questions?
Yeah, how we've talked a lot about solutions. The word solutions keeps being bandied about, but I haven't really heard talk tonight about too many specific solutions. No matter how poignantly the reporting is done, if people don't believe that things can change, then they won't change. So how do you propose changing the public's perception that the solutions are too elusive, that the problem's too intransigent, that it's hopeless? Which is, I find not so much apathy as I do a sense of resignation. And I'm wondering if the media has a responsibility in your judgment to change that perception, and if so, how do we do it? And do you have any specific solutions? Because we hear that word an awful lot, but I haven't heard a whole lot of specifics tonight. And I'd be
Well, one thing I'll say
Hello?
as a journalist,
No, it
the Nigerian author Chebe, who wrote Things Fall Apart, once said that writers give headaches, not solutions. I think what Brenda's doing is different with young people. You know, for me as a reporter, I'm highlighting what other people are doing, but it's not really my job, and that may be seen as a flaw, to come up with public policy solutions. I see my role as highlighting the disparities, highlighting what is happening, and then holding people accountable. I mean, my job, I think journalists are, you know, I fully believe we're the fourth estate and what we do is public service, but we're also there to, again, hold people accountable. And, you know, media agenda setting is really not telling people what to think, but how to think, but what to actually be thinking about.
Chris, can you, in your report, the Mikva challenged a report, and they list a bunch of solutions. Can you be specific on housing, drugs?
Definitely. Mikva worked with Juliana this summer and created a juvenile justice council with County Board President Preckwinkle as well. And so, to you, a specific thing, they came up with 18 solutions to stop recidivism for young people. Any news people in here could report about that whenever they want. My name is on the flyer. You all know Juliana. They would definitely talk about it. And so they came up with recommendations in the area of education, employment, and housing on how to get young people back into the communities positively so they won't go back to jail, to provide the opportunities that they need. I think I have like 2 copies of the report if people want that. Specifics, 4 recommendations that were highlighted. Expungement is a huge issue for young people. They have records that they don't get cleared, so they can't get jobs. They don't know they have records, so they came up with this idea of making an app for your phone where you could start the expungement process, get access to a lawyer. A lawyer will call you and say, here, let me take your hand and walk you through it, because I love young people, but you throw a pebble in their way, they stop. And that's been the experience of expungement. For education, they found that 2% of young people are returning, I think age 16 and 17, are returning back to school after they're being incarcerated. So this is a two-part, but CPD shares juvenile records with CHA so that their families can get evicted. So they came up with this idea that if you're sharing all this information between CPD and CHA, then the JTDC should be sharing information or starting an education evaluation process to help these young people make a plan to get back into school. And that information should be shared with the JTDC and CPS. Housing, they said, it sucks for young people that if you get locked up and you don't have a place to go, you stay incarcerated. So they had this idea. Cook County has this land bank association where they can buy foreclosed properties and clear the title and do stuff, sell it to whoever they want. So they said that you should donate some of these either properties or land to community orgs that are that can provide non-secure detention facilities. What's the word? Rehab facilities. And transitional homes for young people that come out so they can have a place to go. So that's just 3. There's 15 more if anyone wants to check them out. So that's something people can talk about. And there's a ton of other groups doing stuff like that.
Great. Questions? Yeah. Let me go.
Thank you. Well, first let me say that I really respect your work and what you're doing. But I think one of the things that's disheartening to me when I see media reports on violence is a tendency to put the burden on the victims rather than what the true cause of violence in America is. This is industrialized violence, folks. We can't forget this. This doesn't happen in other countries. There's been an abject failure of American policyholders on the gun issue. And they have to be held accountable. And I don't see the media doing that. Why aren't we talking to people in Washington? Why aren't we talking to legislators who keep voting against us? Why aren't we holding these people accountable? This problem is caused by incompetence, by money, and by power. And we are cowering in the face of them. And that needs to get covered. That's all, so that's all I wanted to say, so thanks a lot.
Any response?
Well, I think it does get covered. People are upset that the legislators in D.C. didn't pass any kind of gun control. I mean, the families in the elementary school, they went down to Washington, Durbin and our own U.S. congressman, they seem to be at a stalemate, right? So I don't know, I do know it's been covered. I read the newspapers. Okay, well, I can't answer that. I just know some columnists do kind of dig deep. If you read, the New York Times or the Tribune, every once in a while, someone will kind of get at the core of it. But you're right. Maybe we can ask maybe it can be the banner of a John Cass or somebody, who will just stay on it. But you're right. You're absolutely right.
Okay, next. I think the question is sometimes some of the people who are injured or victims are disabled, and the feeling is that this is harmful when you say that. It makes a person less. My own point of view is that oftentimes people become disabled for violence, and I don't see a lot of those stories about that.
I think what the question is,
Hello? It goes in and
labeling
out.
people as mentally ill if they are a perpetrator of a crime, and is that stigmatizing? Is there a way the news media can avoid that because it's too simplistic? I don't know if I see that on the local level as much as I do on the national level when these mass shootings happen. And I think the audience, that's one of the first questions that they have too. Like, why else would someone do something like that? I will say locally, what we have seen are the shutting down of mental health facilities and what kind of impact, not that those people are going to be violent, but in just trying to better cover mental health issues. When we see that in our communities, the clinics closings have been the story, and a lot of activists have been rallying around that to bring attention.
I was going to say, with regards to, the national piece, when we're talking about shootings like Newtown and the situation that happened in Denver with the Batman movie, and when we're probing into who these people are who are, carrying out these horrific crimes, it is newsworthy. We need to know what's happening in their backgrounds and how were they able to get a gun. And so I think bigger picture, those are, that's a key piece of information that needs to be probed. So, but definitely on the local level, as Natalie was saying, we do have to talk about the mental health. I don't see that as much that we're highlighting people's mental health concerns, not so much, not at least I haven't seen that in my experience in Chicago, but definitely on the national level, I think it's something that we need to consider.
I wanted to ask the person who asked the question if she has seen that in local coverage.
Autistic? He was killed by police?
Testing.
Okay, I do think you're correct. When we hear about the mentally ill in the news, it's usually related to some kind of violent act. One story that I saw in the New York Times last week was how to train police better in dealing with people who may be exhibiting signs of mental illness. And then, we have the woman in Washington, D.C. who was killed, who was trying to go through the White House, the Navy Yard shooting. Almost a year ago, a friend of mine who displayed signs was killed by the police with a taser. And that got news coverage. So, the piece that I am seeing and probably needs to be highlighted is how do police who are not trained in this area, and if they're telling someone to stop and the person isn't stopping, they're trained to unload their weapon. But you do bring up a good point about how to cover, mainstreaming people with these issues when it doesn't have to do with violence.
And you don't really hear about St. Louis on the news nationally, but you always hear about Chicago and the big crimes that happen here. So I was wondering in what ways can you show Chicago's violence, but maybe not so, I don't know, like the girl that got shot from Obama's inauguration parade. That was national news. And now every time someone gets shot, like there was a shooting in a park where like 15 people got shot just recently. People from Mississippi and St. Louis were calling me like, are you okay? Were you there? All this and that. So is there a way that we can like show Chicago in a different light nationally, because we get a lot of negative attention probably everywhere?
Well, one thing I've asked the community media workshop to consider is doing some sort of online resource guide for out-of-town reporters who come here. And I also think when Barack Obama leaves office, this coverage will be downplayed, because you're right, urban violence happens all over the country, but Chicago is the only place that seems to get the attention. The night of that shooting in Back of the Yards, I was asleep, and I get a call from the BBC at 12:30 asking AM if I could be on at 4:45 to talk about that shooting and gang violence. I said, well, I don't even know what you're talking about. And I had a choice, either ignore it and say this is ridiculous, or talk for those 3 minutes about some of these systemic issues that we're talking about. And one of the first questions, why would anyone and this is BBC World, why would the editors in London, much less a global audience, care about a shooting in Chicago and no one died? And the only answer I have is Barack Obama, and that was the first question. I won't do a British accent, but Barack Obama's hometown. It's like, so I had the bully pulpit for a couple of minutes to say, well, no, we don't know if it was gang, all these things that we have talked about, but it is a problem, for all the criticism that the local press should get and does get. The international and national coverage is just way off. And if I see one more Chirac documentary from some other guys in Britain who want to come over, I think my fatigue is going to just explode. So that's what I would like for us to do next in this conversation.
Right, hang on.
I just wanted to say really quickly, also remember that this is something that my generation knew, which was before social media, where you couldn't have a story travel around the world in a matter of seconds. And that is a huge difference about how stories are not only told, but how they are replicated over and over and over again. I remember when it was either in the newspaper and you could read the newspaper, or you might see it on TV. But now, Twitter and all, Facebook, everything, any story with just a click is retweeted, and then it's just throughout the world. So that's one of the factors that I don't really know any solution for how to control that.
Sure. Hang on.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, that Chicago has such a bad reputation over the last couple of years because of, the peaks in violence, specifically last year when we led the nation in the number of homicides. I think the onus is on us, as Chicagoans, to look at especially some of these distressed communities and look at the history behind these distressed communities. We're talking about some really historically important communities like North Lawndale, a crime hotspot, but it's also a really important community. It was a major stop-off point for, it's a huge Jewish community, one of the largest in the U.S. And we need to look at, why North Lawndale became so distressed. Well, what happened to it 40, 50 years ago to make it into what it is today. And, we need to look at, some of the things that happened in North Lawndale, like the panic peddling from realtors that led to, the changeover from Jewish and Italian to black, where realtors lowballed, the owners of property in North Lawndale, and then it turned around and sold these units for exorbitant prices to the black community. And that's the root of what, the problems in North Lawndale today. And there are similar stories in other communities on the south side, South Chicago, which was referenced in the video. Inglewood, I mean, that was, when I was growing up, it was like, outside of downtown, that was the top shopping community in the city. We need to provide some historical reference into what made these communities into what they are today, and that will help, tell,
We have someone waiting here. Hang on.
Please excuse my voice. This is dealing with the solutions to the problem. There used to be a program that allowed the kids, high school kids, make music, poetry, whatever it was. It was a program that took the kids off the street, that kept them safe. It was a safe haven. And it was shut down for community development. It was in Bronzeville. This is probably 9, 10 years back, right around the time of True Star. And they shut it down. And it discouraged me. At that time, I was probably early 20s. It discouraged me because I know I want to open up a program that it's considered like a safe haven for the kids, for them to express themselves and actually be who they want to be. But then we get situations that's political. Oh yeah, it's community development, so we're going to stop this program. Now you're putting the kids back on the street. How do we not discourage people like myself and other people that would like to open up these programs to help keep the kids off the street, to create a solution to the problem? What's your suggestion there?
Well, I would say do it. Don't let that stop you, because one of the things we found out is it's programs like that, True Star, Inglewood, if there are all these little bitty programs, you guys, throughout the city, South Side, West Side, we found out that are actually pushing the envelope with the group of young people and communities that they are involved with. And they are making a difference. The thing is that you don't always hear about them. So I say, if that's your calling, and it should be each of our callings in one way or another, whether you volunteer or whether you want to head up an organization, each of us should be doing something.
Yeah.
And I say, please start that organization.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think, let me just, if I quantify the question as a journalist, I think what she's also asking is there reporting showing how have these programs closed down in these impacted communities? Has anyone done that reporting? Has anyone quantified the loss of these programs? Juliana, have you seen any figures on this at all? Or?
Yeah, I haven't seen any figures on how programs have been shut down, but I was going to say that when I talked about earlier President Preckwinkle's goal of continuing to reduce the population at the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center and instead investing in community-based alternatives to detention, that then brings up another story. So I think what you're talking about is how stories continue. So you might see the violent incident, and then you might know that there's a young person that perhaps ended up in the detention center. What happens when that young person comes out of the detention center? How can that young person reconnect to his or her community? And what kind of programs exist? How do we tell that story? So that when people hear the policy decision of the president of the county board say, we want to invest more in communities, then people don't just hear, oh, she doesn't want kids in detention or people. No, we're saying that there are some ways for those that are charged with nonviolent offenses, there are some things in the community that they could do that's a lot better for them reconnecting to families and communities, and quite frankly, a lot less expensive than detention. The $600 a day that we spend on locking up a kid in detention, what could be done in a program like the one that you're talking about? So there are stories that could, and then when the young person is in the program and then successfully completes the program, tell that story too. Because these are the stories that overall will then continue to shape the policies, that we can say, look what happened here, this was good for rebuilding the community, and it was good for rebuilding that young person. So now they're on the right path, and they're taxpayer and all the other things that people are looking for.
What's the recidivism rate running from the county detention facility? Is it 70 or 80%?
I don't know the number for the detention. I don't know if you know for the detention, but for the jail, it's about 52% in terms of returning after 3 years. And remember, at the jail currently, that starts at 17-year-olds. So we're talking, young people as well.
Can I say something to, was it the young man who was talking about the kid who was killed in Calumet City? Or is it one, oh, she left, okay. Well, right, okay. Just quickly, like you said, talking about stories, that young man his name was Stephon Watts. And I think qualitatively, that's how these stories have to be told. It's not about quantity, it's about quality, right? So his name was Stephon Watts. He was autistic. He wasn't doing anything violent. He had stayed, I've met his family. I've been out there numerous times. So you do have to do the research. He had a butter knife. He was at the bottom of the stairs. The police shot down. They shot him twice. I had to write stuff. Cal City had just gone through a training on how to deal with mentally ill people. They had been to that house 9 times prior. They were very familiar with Stephon, and the 10th time is when he was killed. So I think his story definitely has to, we should know his name.
2 points. The other day, there was about a 30-second story about the mayor and whomever breaking ground, I think it was Olive Harvey, for a new transportation and logistics center. We are not hearing enough about educational opportunities post-high school, training programs. They're abundant, they're around, and we're just not covering them. And these are the opportunities for our young people who do get a high school diploma or equivalent, that they can go into training programs. They're 2-year programs. I am not with city colleges. I don't know the particulars. But there are opportunities out there. Second, addressing this gentleman with Mikva, and this is a totally separate comment. It's important that not-for-profit organizations learn PR techniques and somehow connect with professionals. We know that you don't have the money to hire big names, but there are organizations that will partner with you and train you, not do the work for you, but train you how to better access the media. And it's just a question of a little bit of research on your part and outreach.
Just as Jeanette was talking, I had a story idea. I'm not in a newsroom any longer, but I was just saying, what happens to a dropout? You know, when he or she drops out, it would be a great series if a newspaper had the space or the talent or the people to actually track 5 to 6 dropouts and what's happened to them since they dropped out of school. Wouldn't that be sort of revolutionary? It could be a series. But yeah, Jeanette, people have to think, I think they have to think outside of the box that way, but sometimes newspapers don't have the space. There's not enough time on TV stations to tell it. But that's why, we're here to talk about, the community could tell that story as well. So.
Do you want to talk? Yes.
Sure. Suggestion. Solution, Crane Chicago business story in August, focused on Leak's funeral homes on the south side. It was an excellent, well-balanced story done by Crane Chicago business. It was an excellent, excellent story. The only reason I'm reading that is in this age, social media, people can Google it. It covered all angles. When Attorney Stratton mentioned business, that's what struck because I wasn't going to say anything, simply because for individuals who are in the thick of it every day, the other suggestion as it relates to violence is for individuals who are in the thick of it every day, the teachers who have to still get up and teach their class when a classmate has been killed, and the teacher still has to do his or her job in keeping everybody focused in the midst of, especially Chicago Public School. For those who administer programs, when you've grown up young people and they're dead after years of hard work, and I speak that from a personal standpoint. Mine was a teller who was killed at the bank on 87th King Drive on May 22nd, 2007. So there's a solution and a suggestion, because all of us in this room, this is our city, and we talk around certain things like race and not to each other about solutions. And so thank the panelists for the engaging discussion. And hopefully from that subject of the Crane Chicago business story on Leak's funeral home, it is hopeful that we can move forward as it relates to young people, of which we were once young.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, my name is Dan Bassel. I lead the Tutor Mentor Connection. And my question or request is, newspapers are using maps more frequently in telling their stories to show where a story took place. Someone mentioned earlier the difference in assets available to support youth in poor neighborhoods versus other neighborhoods. Could you do a series of stories, community area by community area, mapping the assets, the youth programs, the different things that are in a neighborhood that are there to help kids, and then do an overlay to that story showing the businesses, the churches, the hospitals, the colleges, the political people who share the same geography. If you begin to tell that story, then you can do two stories off of that. One is you can do good news stories saying, look at the businessman who has business in that neighborhood who gave money into that neighborhood versus gave money to some popular program someplace else. You could give positive recognition to people in the business community doing things they should be doing, and you could move that story around to different neighborhoods using maps to tell that story. The second part is that you can encourage journalists to be volunteers with youth programs to help young people learn to tell the stories like Mikva challenges on blogs and videos, so that if you point to a youth program in a neighborhood, there ought to be stories from that youth program, from the kids, from the volunteers, telling about their neighborhood, telling who they are, who helped them, who whatever, and what they need. If you encourage that to happen, then when a bad news story happens in a neighborhood, you could be pointing to a whole bunch of things in the neighborhood where people are telling the solution and good news and ways to get involved.
Yeah, Ken?
Oh, hi, my name is Andre, and I just wanted to ask a little bit about how communication can be increased between people living in a community, because a lot of times I see in my community people will they won't feel comfortable talking to one another, and I believe that can help mitigate crime or anything that might happen in the neighborhood.
Well, are you talking about a community, a kind of a, what are you talking about in your community? Like an outlet or a vehicle by which people in the community can tell their stories?
So that people just feel comfortable talking to one another.
Oh, well, a lot of that has to do with trust. You can start by building an alliance of people in your community and start talking first just among yourselves. And then you say, we got some good stories here. You start a blog, or you start video, just like John's video. I mean, you guys could do that with a flip camera or your smartphones, and start telling your stories and just assemble several narratives around a common theme.
Natalie, didn't you write about Chatham, the community, or am I thinking somebody else? How the community came together, forming block clubs. I think it's an example of how the community came together, formed block clubs, and as a result of that.
It was more than a regular block club. It was community patrols. They were trained by a police officer, not to interfere if they see something happening, but one deterrent for crime are people on the street, eyes on the street. So these folks at different hours, sometimes the wee hours of the morning, they would have their yellow jackets on, fluorescent, a whistle. They would walk in pairs, and just to be this presence and to also help build community. So this was, these areas already had block clubs, but they were feeling under siege by the abandoned, foreclosed buildings and crime that was happening. So this was their solution.
To me, the message was that people are doing good things in the community, that they're standing together, and that people are not withdrawing. That was a very important message.
And I just have to give one more plug for restorative justice. And I don't know if you've ever participated in a peace circle before, but the idea of restorative justice is that when any incident happens, there's harm that has been done. So we, in general, have a punitive system. And restorative justice says, how do we look at the harm that's been done, not only to the individuals that were a part of the dispute or the conflict, but or the violence, but also the harm that was done to the community, and what needs to be done to repair the harm. Not just punish one person, but what needs to be done to repair the harm. So when you sit in a peace circle, you sit with a talking piece, and only the person who has the talking piece speaks, and you pass it around, and really it allows for you to listen to each other, but it also allows you to talk to one another. And to me, Community Justice for Youth Institute is one of the best organizations for training in peace circles. They go all around the city and the country, quite frankly. and they're in a lot of schools and communities, but there are other organizations as well. So if you're not familiar with restorative justice, that is an excellent way for people, because a lot of the issue that when we talk about violence in young people, a lot of it is because young people feel very disconnected to their communities, from their communities. They don't feel welcome in communities, they don't feel welcome in schools often, and there's a lot of anger behind that. So how do we open our arms and welcome young people into our communities? And that's the kind of conversation you can start.
Can I add one more thing? And Brenda touched on this. I wouldn't rely on mainstream media to report on things and tell your story. We live in such a democratic age now with what's online, and there's so many free programs online. So as Brenda mentioned, you can start a free blog through something like Google Blogger or WordPress. I teach a class at City Colleges. Somebody mentioned City Colleges on Thursday, and that's all we do is we do citizen reporting through blogs. You know, you can work with Google Maps to fairly sophisticated, relay fairly sophisticated information embedded in maps. There are just so many different ways you can communicate for free online. So I would, rely on yourselves too to tell your own stories.
One second. Oh, I got to shout out my people one more time. Sorry. To your point. So when I first started working with Mikva, I worked with middle school students, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Crazy group of kids. And so we were in the Market Park area, and to the thing about the maps, New York Times had put out this map about segregation and like how the country is so crazy. And so we looked at their school, the area around their school. They all lived in the neighborhood. And so on one side it was black, other side it was Latino. And so they decided that was an issue. And one of their solutions was that they would create a garden specific to fighting racism. So they drew a layout of like the flowers spell smash racism or end racism, and they were saying they would have to have block parties and start block by block. So I think media does some things, right? But there's the human connection is still the main thing. And if you want your neighbors to talk, you have to facilitate some type of activity for them to do that. And I think it leads to all these other things.
Actually, a lot of the things that I've been hearing you guys talk about tonight were the impetus behind the project that led to How Long Will I Cry. The idea started after Darian Albert's death, the Fenger High School student who was beaten to death, and the beating was filmed, and you can hear the kid who's taping it laughing while he's filming the boy being beaten to death. And Professor DePaul, Miles Harvey, was so upset by this, and he was trying to come up with some kind of response that was meaningful, that was constructive. And what he and some other people came up with was to listen to individual stories, because I think it's so interesting to hear you guys talk about the limitations as well as the power of the media. And what something like this book can do is it's 35 individuals telling their stories in their own words. There's kids who are in gangs or trying to get out of gangs. There's parents who've lost children. There's a coroner talking about what it's like to prepare a child's body for burial. There's an emergency room nurse talking about how impossible it is to explain to a 15-year-old that yes, it's one bullet and you're not going to walk again. These are all individual stories. They're in their own words, and these books are free because we want these stories to be honored and shared, and because we see them hopefully as a social justice tool, that by hearing these stories and reading these stories and sharing these stories and feeling the weight of these personal experiences and giving them an honor and a space, that it can help us figure out positive ways to approach this problem. And I was so happy to hear you talk about trauma. I just have to say one more thing and then I'll stop, which is that is something I do think the media can do, which is contextualize this. We know so much now about how the adolescent brain isn't formed, and we know so much now about how trauma affects the developing brain, and that's something that a lot of people still don't get, and that's a story that you guys can tell, and that it goes along with the policy stuff, so that people understand that these dollars being spent in these areas are saving human and fiscal treasure. So please take a book if you don't already have one.
We've been doing this for the last 3 years, looking at an issue that's so important, and I think this is one of the best meetings we've had ever. I think the honesty, the power, the energy, and the importance again and again reminds me that we all live in one city, and some of us suffer more than others, but we all care about this, and that this is nothing that we should allow to continue, and that this kind of discussion is so important. And the discussion should be a community-wide discussion, just as we've done here, that we the people need to make decisions too. And I think I just can't thank you enough, folks, for a great discussion. And Natalie, who's been from the very start with us in this effort, and all of you, thanks. It's been a great discussion. Get a book on the way out. If you sign, let us know what you thought about the sessions, answer questions. But I just can't thank you again for coming here and giving us your time. Thank you.